In our prologue, we try to explore what K-pop is. But to understand how K-pop was created, we need to understand in what kind of world it has been born into. And that world was molded not by a beginning, but by the death of a once powerful force in history. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War ended. Soon after, the Soviet Union is no more. Capitalism reigns the world. The USA feels invincible and without any opponent in their fight for global dominance. A dominance that is not only military or economic in nature, but foremost cultural. Western culture has long been molded by the English-speaking nations, and now, above all, the United States. Trends are made in the US. What was true for the capitalistic countries is now true for the whole world. And what does this new world do now? The year is 1992. Without any enemies to fight, it is more than ever all about the money and resources. The economy is what matters, not only in the US. Stock markets and investors take over the scepter, while military and nationalistic ways of thinking are becoming obsolete. Computer technology seems to be the way of the future. In March, Microsoft releases Windows 3.1. And it will be the first ever commercially successful operating system produced by them. 1 month before that, the Maastricht Treaty was signed, the birth of the European Union. In November, Bill Clinton will be elected 42nd President of the United States, and in December, it comes out that Princess Diana and Prince Charles are separated and will get a divorce. This unimportant piece of news will be one of the most important this year. The world is at peace. The 90s, a time of bliss, many will later say. Before the war against terrorism, before climate changes in the mind of people, most are hopeful for the future and enjoy new movies and new music. While not officially a member of the NATO, Korea was one of the most important allies of the Western Alliance. Together with Japan, it was the eastern border of the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese regime. And because of the Soviet puppet North Korea, there's been always a hot border in the midst of the Cold War. The modern music scene in Korea was still very young. Until 1945, it was mostly translated Japanese songs that were popular, not only in part because of the Japanese occupation of Korea. 45 years later, heavier rock and folk sounds with some rap music sprinkled in was what the mainstream charts were made of. And of course ballads, who reigned supreme over all competition. And even before the upcoming revolution, singer-songwriters tried to combine traditional sounds with newer forms of entertainment. But there was a rift within the music community that was not visible at first. While musicians, radio and TV channels believed to know what the public wanted, there was a thirst for something more modern, something new, something spicy. Hope was the motto of the time, and the people of the South looked optimistic to the fragile North Korean dictatorship and its over 80-year-old founder Kim Il-sung. Both could not possibly survive for much longer, especially without the Soviet Union, right? The youth was longing for a new sound that encapsulated this need for pure entertainment without any educational or political messaging. And as one of the most westernized countries, many young musicians looked eastwards over the Pacific Ocean and saw the revival of a music form that died out over 20 years ago. Boy bands were very popular in the 60s and early 70s, but after 1970 and the sudden end of the Beatles, often called the original boy band, only a few survived in the mainstream, while the entertainment industry focused more on solo artists in pop and rock. Afterwards, groups slowly vanished from the music scene, never entirely, but thoroughly overtaken by shining personalities like David Bowie or Elton John, and in the 80s also female stars like Madonna and Cyndi Lauper. Now, group formations were seen as old and used up, and the maybe most famous boy group from the 60s, the Jackson 5, were more or less just seen as a step in the evolution of the king of pop, Michael Jackson. But some Western producers understood very well that old concepts with a new coat of paint are capable to set new trends. In the late 80s, a group named New Kids on the Block was the first real modern boy band with commercial success. Because of that, more people tried their luck in this revived format. In Great Britain, the band Take That would form, and in the US, Boyz II Men was the big new thing. They would become a phenomenon and would inspire many other groups to storm the charts in the upcoming years. But in South Korea, that trend went at first mostly unnoticed. At first.
I cherish every moment that we spend together. Oh, please don't go.
South Korea now is seen as a functioning democracy, comparable to other Western countries, but that was not always the case. After the Second World War, it went through 5 different constitutions until it became the 6th republic that we know today, a democratic system that orients itself towards the US equivalent. But between 1961 and 1987, a military regime was controlling South Korea, and in 1992, democracy was still only 5 years old. That is why many laws and standards in South Korea stem from a time of oppression and dictatorship. Unsurprisingly, there was an ongoing cultural rebellion in the 70s and 80s. The youth was clashing with the lawmakers on every front, fighting small battles to free themselves from all these customs and conventions. A little revolution happened in 1986 when Shin Dae-chul, son of the legendary godfather of Korean rock Shin Jong-hyun, tried to musically distance himself from his father by founding the band Shinawi, the first ever heavy metal band in South Korea. Censorship from the broadcasting channels, as well as constant political pressure, even after the fall of the military regime in 1987, made it hard for the band to remain active after their revolutionary and very successful first album that sold nearly 500,000 copies. Frequent lineup changes were necessary, but many young and talented musicians wanted in on this new sound, which was shaking the foundations of Korean culture, not only musically speaking. In 1990, the band introduced a 17-year-old bass guitar player named Seo Taiji. The 4th album of the band, simply called 4, came out in the same year after 2 years of inactivity. But the pressure on the band mounted, and in 1991, they stopped their activities. Shinawi was ahead of its time. In 1995, 4 years later, with many lineup changes, Shin Dae-chul would reassemble the band, and they are active ever since. But 1991 was very different from 1995 in the small country of South Korea. A place that was changing, a place that was breaking the shackles of the past slowly, but steadily. Seo Taiji, now 18 years old, was suddenly without a group after Shinawi disbanded. He left high school for his music career, just to be back to rock bottom after just 1 small year of activity in a controversial group with many fans, but just as many haters. Because of his short time as an active member, he had nearly no name recognition and also no plan where to go from here on out. Born and raised in Seogyeok-dong, a district in Seoul located in the center of the old city, Seo Taiji was always at the heartbeat of the cultural South Korea. During the dictatorship, the democratically voted National Assembly was a mere puppet, while the real decisions were made here in the traditional districts called Bukchon. The Defense Security Command was located here, and it was the seat of the army, the real government during the times of the regime, which were also the times of Seo Taiji's childhood. 2014, many years later, IU would sing a song written by him about this place of tradition and stagnation. He wrote, "I will live in this pretty village with icicles on the roof and sparrows chirping. Do you remember Seogyeok-dong? It still remains the same." It was here where he was molded into a man that always searched for the new, the different, the way out of tradition and into the modern world. A modern world that was encapsulated by the US and its culture. In his search for musical influences, he came across the boy band craze. Seo Taiji was a good musician. He was a master of the guitar and was planning on performing in a typical band formation, playing his instrument while also singing. But a boy band was something different. A boy band was free from the needs to play instruments. They had a different job. Stage presence was necessary for them. He knew that the tool to achieve that was dancing, even though not all boy bands in the West were great dancers, and he wanted to have choreographies that could entertain just as much as the music itself. There was another problem. After thinking about his future, Seo Taiji wasn't even sure if he wanted to be part of a group again. He had many ideas and didn't want to compromise with others anymore. He abandoned his band plans and began to write songs for a solo debut, but he did not abandon the idea of the boy band concept, which meant that he had to face a slight problem.
Hi, I'm Renata Bliss and I'm your freestyle dance teacher.
The heavy metal guitarist could not dance. And of course, he could also not choreograph a dance. Both were necessary for his new vision to become reality. Taiji had the voice, he had the talent to compose and write lyrics. What he needed was someone who could do the rest. Taiji knew what he had to do and set out to learn from the best artists in Korea. One of those artists was Park Nam-jung, who was a famous singer and actor, the inventor of the so-called L-dance, which was the new big thing in the South Korean late 80s. He in turn had a choreographer and dancer named Yang Hong-seok in his entourage, which he recommended to Taiji for dancing lessons. Little did Park know that his recommendation would lead to him losing his top spot in the dancing scene not even half a year later. Yang Hyun-seok ended his architecture studies to chase his vision of becoming a professional dancer. He was 2 years older than Seo Taiji and already living his dream, choreographing and dancing for famous singers on national TV. Of course, at some point, he wanted to step out of the background, but right in that moment, he was happy where he was. But when Seo Taiji showed him a song that he needed a choreography for, things changed for Hyun-seok. He was mesmerized by this new sound and the talent of Taiji and asked him on the spot if he needed a background dancer. Taiji, planning to be alone on stage up until this point, changed his train of thought, maybe thinking back to the very concept that was getting more and more traction in the West. Maybe he didn't need a background dancer as much as a band member. Lee Jun-ho, a friend of Hyun-seok and famous for being one of the best dancers of his time, was recruited afterwards for the project. He as well joined because he believed in the vision of Seo Taiji, a boy that was 5 years younger than himself.
Still not completely sold on the idea of another group, Taiji was searching for a name that could encapsulate his vision and came up with something that is now regarded the legendary first K-pop group. Seo Taiji and Boys. A name that made clear that this was his project, his child, his vision. The songs were already there. Now all that was needed was a catchy choreography that was still possible for Taiji to learn fast, because time was of the essence. Soon, the TV channel MBC would broadcast a talent show for new artists. Scouts and labels would be watching. So to make his dream a reality, Taiji needed to get attention and, well, sales. And so they trained, they prepared, and they trained even more, just to be ready. To introduce something new to the jury, to the broadcasting channels, to the Korean public. The song Nan Arayo, or in English, I Know, would be their debut on national television. And they made it. On the 11th of April, Seo Taiji and Boys would take their positions on stage. The rest is history. Together with the song, the album would go out for sale. It was a rap song, one of the first ones in Korea, and the dance moves were fresh, but easy enough to copy for a hungry party scene. All that Taiji needed now was the jury to recognize his talent, to give him a boost and make the public aware of his band. Nan Arayo by Seo Taiji and Boys would get the lowest rating of all contestants. Last place. The old entertainment elite was not fond of this new sound, especially not since it was made by a former member of Shinawi, a band that they successfully tried to silence 1 year prior. It was a battle Taiji could not possibly win, not on this tradition-driven system that did not search for new ideas, but simply more of the same. It could have ended here. Beaten and humiliated, Seo Taiji and Boys could have just disbanded. But the public heard the song, and the public was not agreeing with the jury. Within a month of its release, I Know sold over 1.5 million copies countrywide, won a Golden Disc Award in the process, and to this day, Nan Arayo is named in every list of greatest boy band and greatest K-pop songs of all time. Seo Taiji and Boys was not ending on this day, it was only starting. And with it, a trend would start that the elites could no longer keep down. Whenever a fan wants to know more about a band or an idol, she or he will probably Google it. And when one Googles a name or group within the K-pop universe, it is very likely that the website K-Profiles is within the first search results. They offer a somewhat comprehensive overview about personalities and discographies, and they are a great help for orientation in this ever-growing industry. K-Profiles also shows us that there is a bit of a problem with the beginnings of this new genre. If an interested viewer would now go to the site and search for K-pop debuts, it would of course show Seo Taiji and Boys as the first ever K-pop debut in 1992. But after that, a big gap. Only in 1995 they list the next group, Turbo. But that cannot be right, can it? After the great success against all odds, Seo Taiji and Boys kept fighting and kept making music. While doing live shows and promoting their westernized style of music, they also had to jump all the political hurdles. always relying on the public to defend them and artistic freedom in general. Slowly, they urged the state to move the borders of what was deemed acceptable, a bit here, a bit there. Even though highly controversial, they won the Golden Disc Award again in 1993 after they released their second album, Hyoga, English, Anyway. Hyoga was quite different from the first outing Seo Taiji and boys had. Seo Taiji's heavy metal upbringing made a reappearance here, but he combined that with traditional South Korean folk. What stayed the same was the dance-heavy style. Since Yang Kyun-sok and Lee Junho were mainly dancers, the band would of course not sway away from dancing as a second form of artistic expression, equal to singing. But the problems for the band did not end. KBS, the Korean broadcasting system, was controlled and regulated by the state and was banning Seo Taiji and boys from appearing on their channel. State TV was not willing to give screen time to people who wore earrings, ripped jeans and had dreadlocks. Those things were symbols of rebellion against oppressive regimes, and as such they were not well liked by a government that was still struggling with free expression and the own past. Only after a huge outcry against the ban, they were able to perform Hyoga on KBS, weeks after the release. The result is what you are seeing right now, a compromise in which the band wore more acceptable outfits but was allowed to appear on state network. This compromise would be the beginning of a tradition that is active ever since. For example, even today, tattoos must get taped before an idol can appear on television. The conflict of K-pop versus state media went into the next round in 1994. Kyoshil Idea, English Classroom Idea, was the third album of Seo Taiji and boys, and it was a declaration of war against the Korean state. This time, there were nearly no danceable tracks on the album. Instead, it was even more rock and heavy metal focused and condemned the conservative education system, which was trying to pressure the youth into compliance. Direct critique towards the government, a novelty in Korean music history. The band, the fans, and the general public, especially the younger generations, were ready to fight against the officials and the conservatives. A fight that was inevitable and started when the Korean state banned the song Classroom Idea from ever being played on TV or radio. The first step for an even harsher censorship was made. Now the album would have to pass an evaluation of the so-called ethics committees. If it was deemed unethical, the album would be forbidden. Selling or buying it would be punishable, and so much as just playing the songs would be criminalized, even in private clubs. The conservative groups within and outside of the government were not unprepared for this conflict. Seo Taiji and boys were 2 years old by now, and they were on the forefront in the battle of youth culture against the traditionalistic autocracy. The album release was soon overshadowed by a moral outcry based on the accusations that Kyoshil Idea was masking satanic messages and was trying to undermine not only moral but also religious ideals. These kinds of attacks were often seen in the 90s. Especially religious groups were fighting against a new form of media by contributing everything to the devil himself. From punk rock to the Harry Potter books, even in the USA and Europe, those fights were not uncommon.
Just the idea behind rock and roll is very anti-Christ as far as anything I've ever seen, and this is just a number of album covers which depict an image of Jesus Christ that is less than complimentary, I'll put it that way, and flat out blasphemous. This particular one has him sitting on a toilet.
But the difference here was that the Western countries were not controlled by these groups, and censorship was never realistic. In Korea, on the other hand, it was very different. Frozen in time, the power of state and military had a firm grip on what was deemed acceptable. But the times are changing.
And despite all expectations, the public pressure became higher and higher. The first floodgates were opened when the ethic committees passed the album. It was not illegal. It was not unethical to criticize the educational system. And there were of course no satanic messages to be found. The Korean broadcasting system was forced to overthink their ban now. But they couldn't just give up. Too many powerful people expected them to stay firm on the side of tradition and against this new wave of rebellion. New hurdles were placed in front of Seo Taiji and boys. New protest was the answer. During all of this, the band got more and more unexpected help from another source: older artists. Influential voices within the music scene were also bothered by the strict rules against free expression, even though they themselves made a career around them. Another party was involved now, fighting for the rights of other, younger artists to create and express themselves more freely. And just like that, one of the biggest rules, one of the tallest hurdles, one of the now unthinkable laws finally crumbled, making way for Seo Taiji to perform once more on national television.
95년 4집 필승에서 서태지가 빨간 머리를 하고 나오자 KBS에서 머리 염색 규제를 그때 풉니다. 그 전까지는 규제가
제가
있었죠?
그렇게 했다기보다는 뭐 많은 선배님들도 얼마나 고생하셔서 그렇게 읽어놓으신 것 같아요.
Today, parents around the globe know K-pop as the music made by Asians with funny-looking hair. Funky hairstyles are one of the major selling points of new albums. They are often heavily discussed within fandoms. Often they have meaning, often they are just eye-catchers. But they are K-pop, and most wouldn't be able to imagine a world where every idol has the same hair color anymore. Colorful hair had become somewhat of a distinguishing feature for idols. And it all started with Seo Taiji and boys and their fight against the uniformity in Korean TV.
이렇게 보니까 연예인 4명하고 그냥 일반 연예인 4명하고 그냥 고등학생 2명.
The state has lost the battle and was retreating. Seo Taiji and boys were not a K-pop group. K-pop was not even a term back then. It was not a genre. Instead, they were part of a rebellion, part of a movement that was questioning rules and laws, and was challenging the old systems. And even though K-Profile tells us otherwise, they were not alone in this fight. One year before this big clash, in April of 1993, the first other band that can be counted as K-pop debuted. Deuce was a hip-hop duo consisting of Lee Hyun-do and Kim Sung-jae, and was also not going along with the traditional standards of music. This conflict between old and new is painfully visible to a near-perfect degree during their first appearance on national television.
무대를 사로잡는 그룹 듀스 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
While Seo Taiji was the start of K-pop in general, Deuce was the start of the K-pop culture. Their style was copying the hip-hop fashion in the US even more, and their music was leaving behind the heavy metal sounds of Shinawi and Seo Taiji and boys. Of course, they also came under heavy scrutiny during their 2 years of activity, in which they constantly defied the Korean rules of what good music should be. Rules. Rules of what good music should be. Rules of how music is made. Rules of how musicians should look like. Whenever we talk about how the first K-pop artists went against the rules, it leaves a bittersweet taste, right? Because even the greatest fan of K-pop will have to admit that free artists that do what they want is not really something that K-pop is famous for. Giant corporations control the industry, and the idols who sign contracts as long as from Seoul to the moon and back. What is a K-pop group? How should it look like? How should it sound like? Back then, nobody cared. These new artists were not K-pop idols. They were just young people that went against the old, against the boring, against the narrow-minded and state-controlled media. Mixed bands were common in the West. Why not try it out in Korea too?
The band Cool debuted with 4 members, 1 of them female, 3 of them male.
After some trouble within the band, the lineup changed when they released their second album. Yoo Chae-young and Choi Jun-young left, and Yuri came in, meaning that they later consisted of 2 guys and 1 girl. DJDUC was following in the footsteps of Deuce and debuted in 1994 as another hip-hop group. With iconic songs like Dance with DUC and Run to You, they were famous for clashing with the censorship bureau. But they were rewarded with the recognition of their generation and the now mainstream K-pop industry. In the Winter Olympics of 2018, they were one of 15 artists that were headlining the daily medal ceremony aftershow. How ironic that a band can go from repressed by the state to representing the state. Roo'ra, another male and female band, went even further than Seo Taiji and Boys and debuted in 1994 not only with a reggae look, but also with reggae music, which made it necessary for KBS to once again move the goalpost and allow this forbidden form of music. They disbanded in 2001, but reunited for one more album in 2009. Less successful was the band Tutu. Starting as a purely male group consisting of 3 members and named Traffic Light, they changed their name after a female member joined. Their debut single, 1.5, had mainstream success, but being less controversial and more pop-oriented, they were not able to make a lasting impact afterwards and disbanded 2 years later, in 1996. The boy band trio RF tried to produce rave music, but was not able to garner mainstream success. In 1998, they would change the meaning of their name from Rave Effect to Rough Easy Flavor, while also changing their style to a more mainstream hip-hop approach. But unable to escape the shadow of Deuce and DJDUC in this genre, they disbanded 1 year later. Then there's the before-mentioned Turbo, a band that would go on to define K-pop by solidifying one of the basics. First debuting as a duo, consisting of Kim Jong-guk and Kim Jong-nam, they brought back the other mainstay in the Korean music world, dance. Other than Seo Taiji and Boys, dancing was more secondary to the other bands, but Turbo took inspiration from Seo Taiji and focused strongly on dancing, becoming popular as a so-called dance group. But Kim Jong-nam left the group in 1997. This could have been the end of Turbo, a short-lived, very successful dance group. And who knows how K-pop would look like now if Kim Jong-guk would have given up or went on solo. Well, he didn't. Instead, he searched for another partner, and he found Mikey, a young man that moved from South Korea to California when he was only 6 years old and grew up with the US style of music. Together with him, Turbo was revived and made music till 2001. Furthering not only the influence of dancing, but also the westernization of the sound of K-pop. And the best part about Turbo's history is their reunion, but that is a story for another time. And what about Seo Taiji and Boys? In 1995, they released an even more controversial album than the last, showing that they were not yet finished with revolutionizing the music scene. This time, they dove into gangster rap and went on to directly criticize the government. And of course they would again win against the oppressive regime and... No. No, not this time, said the state. This time they went too far. No public outcry, no protest would save them from censorship. Direct criticism of the administration was too much. It was too head-on. The ethics committees allowed the album to be released only if the lyrics of the song Shame of Time would be changed, and the authorities stood firm. Gone is the era of honest people. I wish for a new world that'll overturn everything. I hope I can avenge the grudge in my heart. Instead of changing those 3 lines,
As demanded by the government censors, Seo Taiji opted to release the album only with an instrumental version of the song. The state won, censorship was still in place, the control was regained. But the backlash was, as expected, immense. The process of censorship itself was now in the court of public opinion, and the public was no longer fond of it. Protests continued for a year. Other artists were fighting alongside this new generation and their allies. In 1996, it was finally over. June 1996 marked the end of the so-called pre-censorship, and Shame of Time, the song that made it all possible, released with its original lyrics 1 month afterwards.
예전에 사전심이 있던
네.
거 기억하시죠? 시대의 유감이란 곡은 가사를 수정하라 그랬을 때 제가 그건 못한다고 생각을 해서 덜어낸 그런 좀 처참한 사건도 있었고 이건 아닌 것 같다 싶어서 굉장히 탄원서도 내고 몇십만 명이 수명하고 그래서 팬들이 사전심의 제도가 철폐되는 사건도 있었죠.
Seo Taiji and Boys were not there to celebrate it. Not as an active band, at least. Seo Taiji himself made the decision to retire while writing the 4th album. He would leave the country and live in the US for 2 years. Was he tired of fighting? Maybe. But he would return, with a successful solo career, and with a new one title. Seo Taiji is now known as the President of Culture.
뭐 불합리한 거는 뭐 뜯어고치고 새로운 환경을 맞이하고 이런 거는 좋은 일 같아요.
But for now, his comeback is part of an unsecure future. Now, in the beginnings of the year 1996, K-pop was still free and rebellious. But sadly, some things will never change. And even now, this early in its development, tragedy struck. The first time, but not the last. And in January 1996, the Korean music world was not only struggling to accept the loss of Seo Taiji and Boys, but much more so the loss of Kim Sung-jae. November 19th, 1995. Deuce, the fathers of modern Korean hip-hop, disbanded a few months prior, and Kim Sung-jae had just released his solo debut, As I Told You. To celebrate this, he performed the song at the SBS music program live. Afterwards, he returned to his hotel room. Waiting there, his girlfriend, as well as his entourage. The following morning, Kim Sung-jae was found dead in the very same room. What happened is a mystery to this very day. First, the police found the cause of death to be a heart attack because of overworking and stress. Later, 28 needle marks were found on his right arm. Drugs? No. Traces of an animal anesthetic were proven in his blood. The very same anesthetic that his girlfriend purchased prior to this incident. She was arrested and sentenced to life in prison, but she appealed the decision and came free. The reason? Lack of evidence. Was she really the one that injected the deadly formula into his body? Nobody knows. Kim Sung-jae was one of the pioneers of K-pop. He fought side by side with the others, and he would surely have had a great career waiting for him. But at the age of 23, he was murdered, tragically making him not only a trendsetter for music, but also the first victim of a curse that followed Korean pop ever since. Not just Seo Taiji's retreat from Korea, but also the death of Kim Sung-jae ended the free and rebellious phase of K-pop. And just like that, the year 1996 marked so much more for K-pop than just the end of the strictest form of censorship. it also marked a new step for the genre. Now that the artists were established and this new form of entertainment was less risky, less under scrutiny, and more accepted, the powerful became interested. Money was to be made, and they feared a new generation of artists that were outside of their control. And while the Korean music world was in shock, a new player was preparing his move. A player that was not primarily an artist, but instead part of the very thing Seo Taiji and Kim Sung-jae fought against. The business people were waking up, and if politics could not destroy K-pop, then money could maybe control it. 1996 would be the year of SM Entertainment's first move into the K-pop world.